At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Aurum. Let's begin. Professor Lamarck activated the 3D display at the center of the circular classroom, causing millions of floating particles to form the title of today's lesson in the 3 languages spoken by his students. The bright words read, "Humans, the ones who learned peace only after mastering war." He stood there for a moment, his pale purple skin shifting as he drew in a slow breath. Lamarck was bipedal, with proportions not unlike a human himself, though his species had evolved on a world 3 spiral arms away from Earth. The horns were small, barely 3 inches tall, and curved backward, a vestigial feature from ancestors who had once needed them for territorial displays. Now they served mainly to make younger species nervous during first contact, which Lamarck found mildly amusing. His eyes moved across the circular classroom, a layout born not of prejudice but of biological necessity. The room was divided into 3 distinct sections, each tailored to the specific needs of the species who occupied them. The furab section had specialized air filtration to contain their loose silver fur, which could trigger severe allergenic reactions in the rapil. The rapil section, in turn, was climate-controlled to a higher temperature and equipped with barriers to prevent their pheromone signatures from overwhelming the sensitive olfactory symptoms of the other species. The mimic section required no special accommodations beyond reinforced seating that could adapt to their different forms. Lamarck's gaze settled on the furab section, where Atty sat in the front row as always. She was one of his best students, her silver fur meticulously groomed, her posture attentive. The furab were a diligent species, methodical in their approach to learning, and Atty exemplified these traits. Her ears were perked forward, dark eyes fixed on the glowing tile that still hung in the air between them. "Atty," Lamarck said, "before we begin, I'd like to know, how much do you already know about humans?" Atty's pawed hands moved to her short snout, a habitual gesture when she was thinking. Her claws, retractable, unlike those of her more primitive ancestors, scratched lightly at the silver fur of her muzzle. When she spoke, her voice was clear.
"I know that humans are an old species, Professor,"
she began, her tail moving from side to side with the effort of concentration.
"They control most of the major stellar commercial routes in the galaxy and charge a 5% transit fee that most trading vessels consider reasonable. The fees fund their patrol fleets, which keep the routes safe from piracy and spatial anomalies."
She paused, one paw still touching her snout.
"I also know that humans live extraordinarily long lives. Some say they've mastered their own biology to the point where aging is optional. I've heard rumors of digitalized consciousness, though I'm not sure if those are true or just speculation. What I do know is that human medical practitioners are considered among the best in the galaxy. Many species travel to human-operated hospitals for treatments that would be impossible elsewhere."
Her ears, which had been rigid with attention, softened like jelly as she concluded.
"Most species in the galactic community see humanity as the role model, the example of what a civilization should strive to become. They're peaceful, prosperous, and protective of younger species."
Lamarck nodded. There was nothing wrong with her answer. Every fact she'd stated was accurate. The humans did control the major trade routes. They did live longer than most species could imagine, their biomedical technology having conquered diseases, aging, and even death itself for those who chose to embrace it. And yes, they were seen as the model civilization, the standard by which others measured their own progress toward enlightenment. "Thank you, Atty," he said, but as he began walking in circles around the central platform, his mind turned over her words. Her understanding was shallow, he thought, factually correct but lacking depth, like knowing the chemical composition of water without understanding the ocean. She knew what humanity was, but not how they had become it. That was, of course, the purpose of today's lesson. He moved across the circular platform, his footsteps silent on the sound-dampening floor, and stopped at the repill section. The students there sat on heated benches, their cold-blooded metabolisms requiring the extra warmth. Their scales ranged from deep emerald to bright yellow, and their snouts, long when compared to their heads, were the primary reason for the physical divisions in the classroom. Those snouts were impressive, capable of detecting chemical signatures from miles away, but they were also incredibly sensitive. A single strand of furub fur could send a repill into a sneezing fit that would last for hours. Lamax stopped directly in front of Inib, a young male with brilliant yellow scales. He was another of Lamax's top students, though his approach to learning was vastly different from Atti's methodical study. "Inib," Lamax said, "do you have anything to add to what Atti has told us about humans?" The response was immediate, almost military. Inib's spine straightened, his long snout tilting upward. "Yes, Professor. Humans are notable for their restraint in the use of lethal force. In conflicts with other species, they employ non-lethal suppression technologies almost exclusively." His nictitating membranes flickered across his eyes as he accessed his memories. "In the Kepler-2 border skirmish of 2 centuries ago, human peacekeepers intervened in a territorial dispute between the Taxian clans and the Vril Alliance. Without taking casualties, human forces used superior tech to claim victory. No fatalities were recorded on any side." Inib's snout dipped slightly, and Lamont could see the young Repill was straining to remember more details. Before he could continue, Lamont raised a hand. "That's enough, Inib. Thank you." As he resumed his pacing around the circular platform, Lamont reflected that Inib's answer, like Atti's, was not wrong. The humans were indeed remarkably reluctant to kill, even when killing would be easier, cheaper, or more expedient. Their weapons technology was sophisticated enough to incapacitate without causing permanent harm, and their legal philosophy emphasized rehabilitation over retribution. But again, this was the what, not the how or why. It was the surface of the ocean, not its depths. He turned toward the mimics section, and his expectations rose. The mimics were shapeshifters, beings without permanent form who could sample DNA and restructure their bodies to match almost any biological template. For centuries, they had been feared and persecuted across the galaxy. Their ability to perfectly impersonate other beings had made them targets of suspicion and violence. Entire worlds had attempted to purge mimic populations, terrified of the idea that anyone might be a shapeshifter in disguise. It had been humans who stopped the genocide. Humans who had stood before the Galactic Assembly and declared that the mimics had as much right to exist as any other sapient species. Humans who had offered the mimics sanctuary and protection when no one else would. Even today, Earth itself, the human homeworld, welcomed mimics without restriction, one of the few species granted such unrestricted access. Surely, Lamont thought, a mimic student would understand humanity's history on a deeper level. He stopped in front of Tilla, a student currently manifesting as a feathered biped with brilliant blue plumage and an elaborate crest atop her head. She was the only feathered individual in the mimic section today. Her classmates had chosen forms ranging from aquatic to crystalline. Mimics rarely kept the same appearance for more than a few days, seeing their shape-shifting nature as a form of artistic expression. "Tilla," Lamont said, "what can you add to our discussion?" Tilla's crest feathers ruffled, a gesture she'd borrowed from an avian species she'd once studied. When she spoke, her voice was clear and thoughtful.
"I know their past, Professor. They were a mess in their distant past. A fractured species that nearly caused the extinction of countless life forms on their own planet."
She reached up with one wing arm to touch her head crest, a borrowed gesture that somehow seemed entirely natural on her.
They were divided into hundreds of competing nations, constantly at war with each other over resources, ideology, and territory. Their industrial revolution nearly destroyed their biosphere. They developed weapons capable of rendering their entire homeworld uninhabitable, and they came terrifyingly close to using them.
A pause, and then,
But somehow they learned to do better. They learned to unite, to see themselves as one species rather than competing tribes. They learned to heal their world and to become what they are today, the most peaceful, prosperous, and powerful civilization in the known galaxy.
her crest flattened slightly.
I'll admit, Professor, I don't know the details of how that transformation happened. I understand the beginning and the end, but the middle, the actual journey from what they were to what they are, that's unclear to me.
Lamarck felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, an answer that showed true understanding. Tila knew the basics of humanity's history and, more importantly, she recognized the gaps in her knowledge. She understood that there was a story between the violent past and the peaceful present, and she was honest enough to admit she didn't know it. "Excellent, Tila," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "Your honesty does you credit." He returned to the center of the platform, his eyes briefly touching on all three sections of the classroom. The Furabs sat attentively, their ears perked. The Repil were motionless, their thermal sensors focused on the 3D display. The Mimics had all shifted, unconsciously adopting more compact forms to better focus on what was coming. Lamarck's fingers moved across the control interface embedded in the platform, and the floating particles that had displayed the lesson's title suddenly scattered and reformed. The new images that took shape were startling in their violence. Military aircraft screaming across burning skies, massive tanks rolling across devastated landscapes, ships exploding in balls of fire on churning seas, soldiers in primitive uniforms charging across muddy fields into walls of gunfire, cities reduced to rubble, their populations fleeing in terror, mushroom clouds rising over flattened urban centers. "This," Lamarck said, beginning to pace as the images shifted and changed around him, "is what humanity was before their spacefaring age, before they reached the stars, before they became the species you know today." He had given this lecture dozens of times, had refined it over the years until every word synchronized perfectly with the images in the display. He controlled every image, timed every transition. The result was a performance as much as a lecture, and he had become a master of it. "The images you see come from a period humans call World War II, though it was far from the only global conflict they experienced. This war took place in the mid-20th century of the human calendar, roughly 200 years before they developed faster-than-light travel. It lasted 6 years and involved nearly every nation on their planet." The particles reformed to show rows of soldiers, their faces young and afraid. Over 70 million humans died in this conflict. Let me put that number in perspective for you. That's more than the current population of 30 settled Furab worlds, killed not by disease or natural disaster, but by other humans. A new image: concentration camps, their victims skeletal and haunted. Humans committed genocide against their own kind, murdering millions based on ethnicity, religion, and ideology. They developed industrial methods for killing, turning mass murder into an assembly line process. The display shifted to show cities aflame. They firebombed population centers, deliberately targeting civilians. Lamarck paused, letting the images speak for themselves. He glanced at the Furab section and saw wide eyes, mouths slightly open in shock. Several students were whispering to each other, their ears flat against their skulls, a sign of distress. In the Repil section, similar reactions. Inib's scales had paled, his snout lowered. Even for a species that had evolved from predators, the scale of human violence was stunning. Only the mimics seemed unsurprised, though Lamarck noted that several had unconsciously adopted more defensive forms, their bodies compacting. A hand rose from the Furab section. Not Atty, but another student named Kelm.
Professor?
He said, his voice higher than usual.
How does a species like that become the humanity we know today?
That, Lamarck said, is exactly the right question. His fingers moved across the controls, and the images of World War II dissolved. New formations took their place, showing something far older and more alien. Massive structures floated in the void. Space stations the size of moons, ringed with weapons platforms that could sterilize worlds. Fleets of warships, each one a gleaming symbol of absolute power, and everywhere, the symbol. 3 interlocking rings surrounding a stylized star. To understand how humanity became what they are, you must first understand what the galaxy was like when they reached it. You must understand the Galactic Order. Lamarck began pacing again, slowly this time. The 3D display shifted to show a map of the galaxy, half of it bathed in the cool blue light of the Order's territory, the other half a chaotic swirl of red, orange, and yellow, unmarked space where no laws held sway. 400 years ago, when humans first developed faster-than-light travel and ventured beyond their solar system, they found a divided galaxy. On one side, the Galactic Order, a totalitarian regime that had existed for over 2,000 years. They ruled approximately 40% of the habitable worlds in the galaxy, maintaining control through a combination of overwhelming military force and sophisticated surveillance technology. The display zoomed in on an Order space station. The Order believed in absolute conformity. Species under their rule were required to abandon their native cultures, languages, and governments. A murmur ran through the classroom. Even the Repill, usually stoic, showed signs of discomfort. The other half of the galaxy, Lamarck continued, and the display shifted to show the chaotic regions, was complete anarchy. No central government, no universal laws. Piracy was rampant. Slavery was common. Worlds rose and fell based on whoever had the most guns. It was a nightmare where only the strong or the clever survived. The display now showed Earth, a blue-green jewel floating in space, and Lamarck's voice took on a different tone. When the Galactic Order discovered Earth, they did what they always did with new spacefaring species. They sent emissaries with an offer. Join the Order voluntarily, surrender your sovereignty and your culture, and you will have the Order's protection. Refuse, and face the consequences. New images formed. Human diplomats sitting across from Order representatives, their body language making clear the tension in the room. Humans refused. They had just emerged from centuries of bloody conflict and had finally begun to unite as a species. The display showed Order warships appearing in Earth's orbit. The Order was patient at first. They imposed economic sanctions. They blocked human ships from accessing established trade routes. They interdicted human colonies in nearby star systems, cutting them off from their homeworld. All of this was designed to force Earth to capitulate without firing a shot. Lamarck's voice hardened. But humans are a stubborn species. They had endured their own world wars and emerged stronger. They had stared into the abyss of their own potential extinction and pulled themselves back from the brink. The display showed battles now. Human ships, primitive by modern standards, fighting desperately against the overwhelming might of the Order's fleets. Lamarck saw several students lean forward, even knowing how this story would end. The Order escalated. Trade blockades became military strikes. Warning shots became bombardments. And then came the ultimatum. Join or face extinction. In the Furab section, Attie's paws had clenched into fists. Several of her classmates were making soft, distressed sounds, their ears flat. The Repil were silent, but Lamont could see their nictitating membranes flickering rapidly. Humanity, Lamont said, made a choice that would define their future. Rather than surrender, rather than watch their homeworld die, they evacuated. In the largest mass exodus in recorded history, over 3 billion humans abandoned Earth. They loaded everything they could onto every ship they had. Colony vessels, cargo haulers, military craft, even refitted pleasure yachts. And they fled into the anarchic half of the galaxy, the lawless regions where the Order's authority meant nothing. The display showed the exodus, thousands upon thousands of ships streaming away from Earth, a desperate diaspora fleeing into the unknown. The Order bombarded Earth with kinetic weapons and biological agents. They poisoned the oceans, burned the forests, and made the atmosphere toxic to human life. They left the planet as a warning to other species. This is the price of defying the Galactic Order. Silence filled the classroom. Even Lamach paused, letting the weight of that tragedy sink in. Earth turned into a dead world. Humanity cast into the chaos of lawless space with no home to return to.
Professor?
The voice came from the Repel section. It was a student named Valak, his green scales muted in distress.
When you say the anarchic regions had no laws, how did humans survive there?
It was a good question, Lamach thought, and exactly the kind of engagement he wanted from his students. You're right to wonder. Humanity's situation seemed hopeless. The display shifted again, now showing human settlements on harsh, hostile worlds. Dome cities on airless moons, underground warrens on radiation-blasted planets, orbital habitats clinging to the edges of asteroid fields. But something remarkable happened, Lamach said, and there was a note of admiration in his voice. Humanity had been fractured before, divided into competing nations and ideologies. But losing Earth, watching their homeworld die, united them in a way nothing else had. They were scattered physically across dozens of worlds, but they were more unified than they had ever been in their history. They were united by a single burning purpose: revenge against the Galactic Order and the dream of returning home. He moved to stand at the very center of the platform now, leaning against the controls of the 3D display. The particles swirled around him as he spoke, forming images that illustrated his words. Humanity spent the next 50 years building. They established covert colonies on marginal worlds the Order had dismissed as worthless. They began trading with the anarchic region's various factions, offering their labor in exchange for resources and technology. They learned and grew stronger. The display showed human engineers studying alien technology, human diplomats negotiating with bizarre alien species, human soldiers training in foreign fighting techniques. And then, he said, humanity did something that the galaxy had never seen before, something that even today historians regard as the most impressive diplomatic achievement in recorded history. The display exploded with images, hundreds of different alien species, thousands of different worlds, all connected by threads of light that converged on scattered human colonies. Humanity began building an alliance. Lamach straightened, his voice rising. They reached out to every species the Galactic Order had wronged, every civilization the Order had threatened, every race that lived in the anarchic regions and feared the Order's expansion. They found the mimics, hunted and persecuted, and offered them protection. They found species like the Korvax, whose homeworld the Order had strip-mined into uselessness, and offered them vengeance. They found aggressive species like the Faxians, and dangerous species like the Vril, and unusual species like the Collective, and they offered them all the same thing. Join us, and together we can end the Order's tyranny. The images shifted rapidly now, showing meeting after meeting, negotiation after negotiation. It took decades. Humans had to learn to communicate with species whose biology was so different from their own that they barely recognized each other as sentient. They had to find common ground with civilizations whose values were incomprehensible to human thinking. They had to prove again and again that they were trustworthy, that they would honor their agreements, that they could be relied upon as partners. Lamarck glanced around the classroom and saw that every student was frozen in their seat, transfixed. Even the usually fidgety younger Furab were motionless, their ears perked forward. In the process of building this alliance, humanity had to change. They had to learn true cooperation, not just working together with other humans who shared their biology and basic worldview, but working with species that thought differently, communicated differently, valued different things. They had to suppress their old instincts toward tribalism and division. They had to become something new. The display showed human commanders standing shoulder to shoulder with alien generals, planning operations. Human scientists collaborating with beings whose methods of research would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Human diplomats negotiating treaties in a dozen different languages simultaneously. And they learned war, Lamarck said, and the display shifted to show military forces gathering. Not the war they had known on Earth, the confused, chaotic slaughter of World War II and the centuries that followed. They learned strategic warfare on a galactic scale. They learned more and more from every species they allied with. The Faxians taught them ship-to-ship combat tactics. The mimics, he nodded toward Tilla's section, became their intelligence network, infiltrating Order facilities and providing the Allies with priceless information. The display showed a mimic shape-shifting through a dozen forms, each one perfectly mimicking an Order official. Mimics could go where no other species could steal secrets that should have been impossible to obtain. Without them, the war would have been lost before it began. New images now, massive fleets assembling in deep space, their formations precise and deadly. Humanity collected technology from hundreds of worlds. They took what worked and discarded what didn't. They innovated, combining techniques from different species in ways no one had thought possible. Within 80 years of fleeing Earth, they had built the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Lamarck began pacing again, slowly, as the 3D displays showed battle after battle. And then they went to war. The display showed hit-and-run attacks on Order supply lines, mimic infiltrators sabotaging Order space stations from within. Entire Order fleets ambushed and destroyed in carefully planned operations. Humanity employed guerrilla warfare on a scale that had never been seen in space. The Order was used to fighting conventional wars, fleet against fleet, world against world. They didn't know how to handle an enemy that struck from the shadows and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The battles shown in the display grew larger, more complex. The war lasted for over a century. Multiple human generations lived and died without ever seeing Earth, but humanity never forgot. They passed down the story, the dream of returning home, and slowly, painfully, they won. Lamarck's voice grew stronger, more passionate. They didn't defeat the Order in one climactic battle. This wasn't a story where the hero fires the perfect shot and the enemy explodes. They won through 100 years of small victories that accumulated into an unstoppable momentum. They captured Order worlds and offered the conquered populations something the Order never had: freedom to choose their own path. Many of those worlds joined humanity's alliance willingly. The display showed Order territory slowly shrinking, the blue light being replaced by the greens and golds of the Allied forces. The Order's rigid structure became its weakness. They couldn't adapt to humanity's fluid tactics. They couldn't match the creativity that came from humanity's diverse alliance. They couldn't inspire the loyalty that humanity had earned through decades of proving themselves trustworthy partners. New images, Order officials signing surrender documents, Order warships powering down their weapons. The symbol of the 3 interlocking rings being torn down from space stations across the galaxy. 240 years after Earth was destroyed, the Galactic Order was dissolved. Not in an explosion, but a whimper. Their leadership surrendered, their military was disbanded, and their territories were reorganized into independent states. The totalitarian nightmare that had ruled 40% of the galaxy for 2,000 years simply ended. Lamarck paused, and in that pause a hand rose from the Furub section. It was Kelm again, her voice shaking slightly.
Professor, what happened to Earth?
The display shifted to show a world slowly healing. Green continents emerging from gray wastelands, blue oceans clearing of toxins, an atmosphere gradually becoming breathable again. Humanity returned home, Lamarck said softly. The first thing they did after the Order's surrender was begin the restoration of Earth. It took 50 years and the combined technological might of their entire alliance, but they did it. They brought Earth back to life. A new image, humans standing on Earth's surface, many of them weeping, none of them old enough to remember the planet before its destruction. Most of the humans who returned had never seen Earth. They were the great-great-grandchildren of the refugees who had fled centuries before, but they remembered through stories, through cultural memory, through the dream that had sustained their species through centuries of struggle.
Professor?
This time it was Inib, the Rapil student.
You said humanity learned peace through war, but this is a story of revenge and military conquest. Where is the peace?
Exactly the right question, Inib, Lamarck said, smiling. Because the peace came from what happened during the war, not after it. The display shifted to show humans working alongside dozens of different species. Humanity went into exile as a fractured species, barely unified. They emerged from the war as something entirely different. They had spent centuries learning to cooperate with beings who were nothing like them. They had learned to communicate across barriers that seemed insurmountable. They had learned to value different perspectives, different approaches, different ways of thinking. Images of humans mediating disputes between allied species. Humans designing systems that accommodated wildly different biological needs. Humans creating legal frameworks that worked for species with incompatible values. The war forced them to grow beyond their tribal instincts, Lamarck continued. They couldn't afford petty divisions among themselves, not when their survival depended on unity. They couldn't afford to discriminate against alien species, not when those aliens were their allies and friends. They had to become truly cosmopolitan, truly galactic in their thinking. And when they returned to Earth, Lamarck said, and the display showed the restored planet spinning peacefully, they brought that transformation with them. Earth today has no borders, no separate nations. It's governed by a unified democratic council that includes representatives from every human colony world and also includes a few seats for the species that fought alongside humanity during the war. He gestured toward the mimics section. Mimics are welcome on Earth without restriction because they had earned that right during the war. They saved human lives, sacrificed their own, and helped humanity achieve the impossible. Tilla, the mimic student, had tears forming in her currant eyes. Several other mimics in her section had adopted forms that expressed emotion in ways their bodies usually didn't. Glowing colors, specific postures, even mimicked human expressions. The humans who control the trade routes today, Lamarck said. The humans who run the galaxy's hospitals, the humans who are seen as the ultimate example of a peaceful civilization, they're not the same humans who nearly destroyed Earth in World War II. They're the descendants of refugees who lost everything and had to rebuild not just their civilization, but their entire way of thinking. The display showed modern human cities, gleaming and peaceful. Human hospital ships tending to wounded from a dozen different species. Human peacekeepers intervening in conflicts with non-lethal force. Human merchants trading fairly even with the smallest, weakest civilizations. They learned peace through war, because war taught them the cost of division, Lamarck said. It taught them that cooperation was stronger than competition. It taught them that diversity was strong when done correctly. He looked around the classroom at his students. This is why humans are so reluctant to kill Inib, because they know better than any species in the galaxy what killing leads to. They've seen and done the worst of what sapient beings can do to each other, and they've consciously chosen to do better. A hand rose. Atty again.
Professor, do you think other species can follow humanity's path?
Lamarck smiled. That is the question that guides all my teaching. Humanity's path was brutal, but the lessons they learned don't require that brutality to understand. You're learning them right now, in this classroom, sitting alongside species different from your own, cooperating in pursuit of education. The display faded, the particles returning to a neutral glow. The galactic community we live in today was built on humanity's sacrifice and humanity's transformation. We have peace because humans proved that peace was possible even after experiencing the worst war imaginable. Lamarck looked around at his students, saw the understanding in their eyes, saw how the story had moved them. The mimics, so long persecuted, now understood why humanity had protected them when no one else would. When you leave this classroom today, Lamarck said, I want you to remember this. Humanity didn't become peaceful because they were naturally inclined toward peace. They became peaceful because they learned through terrible experience that the alternative was extinction. They became the galaxy's healers because they had been the galaxy's greatest killers and had consciously chosen to become something different. He paused, letting his words settle. That choice to consciously become better is available to every sapient species. You simply need to make the choice every day to be better than your worst instincts. Questions came then, as Lamarck had known they would. Small questions about specific battles, about the technology humans had developed, about the current relationship between Earth and the species that had fought alongside humanity. He answered each one patiently, thoroughly, but his mind was already on the lesson he had taught, the lesson that transcended facts and dates and specific historical events, the lesson that a species could change, could grow, could become more than its past suggested was possible. As the students began gathering their materials, preparing to leave for their next class, Lamarck saw satisfaction in their faces. They had enjoyed his lecture, yes, but more than that, they had understood it. They understood that humans had done it. They had learned peace only after mastering war, had become the best healers only after becoming best killers, had achieved unity only after experiencing the ultimate division. And if humanity could do it, Lamarck believed, then any species could.